The Frog Prince. In the olden times there lived a king, whose daughters were all beautiful, but the youngest was the most beautiful of all. Near the king's castle was a large and gloomy forest, and in the midst stood an old lime tree, below which was a well, the water of which was clear as crystal. People thought much of this well. They said that the water came up from the heart of the earth and was good for all kinds of sicknesses, and they used on May Day to put a wreath of flowers round it. The king's daughter often went to this well, and one day as she was there, it was May Day, and all the well was set about with flowers. As she leaned to smell the flowers and looked down into the water, a gold ball with which she was playing fell out of her hand and tumbled into the well. Then she was very unhappy and sat beside the well crying. Then all at once she heard a voice from the water that called out, "Why do you weep, king's daughter?" She looked about her and saw a frog popping its ugly head out of the water. "Oh, you ugly creature," said she, "I am crying because I have lost my golden ball that has slipped away from me and has fallen into the well." "Be still and do not cry," answered the frog. "I can help you, but if I restore the ball, what will you do for me?" "Dear good frog," said she, "I will give you my rings and necklaces." The frog answered, "Rings and necklaces I want not." "Then," said she, "I will give you my silk dresses." "Silk dresses I value not," said the frog, "they would be spoiled by the water." "I will give you lollipops," said the princess. "They would melt in the water," answered the frog. "I will give you my little gold watch," said she. "The water would stop the work," said he. "Then you shall have my little red shoes," said she. "They are too large for my feet," he answered. "Then the gold comb with which I fasten up my back hair," she said. "I have no back hair, never had, never shall," replied the frog. "What then can satisfy you?" she asked, and began to weep again. The frog answered, "If you will love me, and let me be your companion and playfellow, and sit at your table, and eat off your plate, and drink out of your cup, and sit on your shoulder, and whisper into your ear, and sleep on your little bed, then and only then will I dive down and bring up your golden ball." "I will promise all this," said the princess, "if you will only get me my precious ball." But she thought to herself, "What is this silly frog saying? Let him remain in the water and associate with F's and newts, and not seek to mix in human society." Now the frog, as soon as he had received her promise, drew his head under water and dived. Presently up he came to the surface with the ball in his mouth and threw it on the grass. The king's daughter was full of joy. She picked up the ball and forgot even to thank the frog. She turned to run away. "Stay, stay," called the frog. "Take me with you. I cannot walk as fast as you do." But all his croaking was in vain. The king's daughter would not hear it, but hastening home soon forgot the poor frog, who was obliged to leap back into the fountain. Next day, when the princess was sitting at table with her father and all his court, and was eating from her little golden plate, something was heard coming up the marble stairs, splish splash, splish splash, and when it arrived at the top it knocked at the door, and a voice was heard calling, "Open the door, youngest daughter of a king." So she rose and went to see who was calling for her, and when she opened the door and caught sight of the frog, she shut it again with great haste and went back to her place at the table, looking deadly pale. When the king saw how frightened she was, he asked her whether there was an ogre at the door who wanted to eat her. "Oh no," she answered, "it is not an ogre, but an ugly wet frog." "And what does the frog want with you?" asked her father. "My father," she answered, "as I was at the well yesterday, I dropped my golden ball into it, and the ball sank to the bottom. I cried greatly, and then a frog came to the surface and promised to restore to me the ball if I would make him my playfellow, and suffer him to eat off my plate, drink out of my cup, sit on my shoulder, and sleep on my bed. Now he has left the well and has come here." Then the frog was heard calling at the door, Open the door, my honey, my heart, open the door, my dear. Remember the oath atwixt us both, adown by the wellhead clear. The king said, a promise is a promise, whether made to prince or beggar, to man or toad. So the king's daughter went to the door and opened it. Splish, splash, splish, splash. In waddled the frog and stood by the princess's chair. She sat down and looked very white, and her heart beat fast. Then the frog said, lift me on your lap, my honey, my heart, lift me on your lap, my dear. Remember the words to me you spake, adown by the wellhead clear. So the princess stooped and took up the frog and set it on her lap and put her hands on the table. Then the frog said, give me to eat of your dainty meat, from your golden plate, my dear. Remember the oath atwixt us both, adown by the wellhead clear. So she was obliged to let the frog feed from off her plate. The courtiers looked on and were very astonished. As for the princess, she could eat not another bite. Then said the frog, give me of your cup that I may sup, of your golden cup, my dear. Remember the oath betwixt us both, adown by the wellhead clear. Then she put the cup to the cold lips of the frog, and he drank a little drop, but after that she could not take any draught from the cup. Then when the frog had eaten and drunken to his satisfaction, all the court rose from table and retired to the drawing room, and the princess would have walked away and dropped the frog on the floor, but the frog cried out, take me on your shoulder, my honey, my heart, take me on your shoulder, dear. Remember the oath betwixt us both, adown by the wellhead clear. So the princess was obliged to take up the frog and set him on her shoulder, and then he put his cold lips to her ear and said, fair maid, do not weep, 'tis time to sleep. Carry me to the bed, my dear. Remember the oath betwixt us both, adown by the wellhead clear. At this the king's daughter began to cry. She could not bear to think of the clammy cold frog on her beautiful clean white counterpane, and she thought that whilst she was asleep he might hop onto her face and wake her with fright. But indeed she did not think she could sleep at all with the nasty creature in her room. But the king was angry at her reluctance. He said again that what she had promised must be observed. To break a promise was dishonorable in a poor man. It was most disgraceful in one of royal blood. So she went to her room with the frog squatted on her shoulder, and when there, she threw him on her counterpane. Then the frog said, chop off my head, my honey, my heart. Come, chop off my head, my dear. If you love me strong, be speedy, not long, and chop off my head without fear. The princess was greatly alarmed, but she got an axe and chopped, and cut off the head of the frog. Then all at once there stood before her a beautiful prince, and all traces of the frog had disappeared. And he told her how that he had been transformed into a frog by a witch, and that he could never have recovered his own shape again unless some young girl had promised to let him eat out of her plate, drink out of her cup, sit on her shoulder, and sleep on her bed. The princess was so delighted that she ran and called her father and mother and all the court, and they all sat down to table again and ate a second supper, for delight and surprise had made them all hungry again. And at this second supper it was agreed that the princess and the prince should be married. Next day, when the sun rose, a carriage drawn by 8 white horses with golden harness drove up to the door of the palace, and behind the carriage stood trusty Henry, the servant of the young prince. When his master was transformed into a frog, trusty Henry had grieved so greatly that he had bound 3 iron hoop bands round his heart, for fear lest it should break with grief. Now he came with the carriage to take the prince back to his own country, and the faithful fellow helped in the bride and bridegroom, and then mounted the seat behind, full of joy at his master's recovery of his proper form. They had not proceeded very far before the prince and princess heard a crack as though one of the carriage springs had given way. The prince put his head out of the window and asked trusty Henry what was broken. His servant answered, It is nothing in or about the carriage, dear master, but one of the bands has given way that I had bound round my heart when I was in grief because you were changed into a frog." Twice afterwards on the journey they heard the same noise, and each time the prince thought that some portion of the carriage had given way, but it was only the breaking of the bands that bound the heart of trusty Henry. Thenceforth all lived in happiness.